Good afternoon. I'm here with my guest, Stephanie Schorow. And she wrote something called, for those of you who don't remember, The Combat Zone, the infamous district in Lower Washington Street. Actually, it's the stripped-down story of Boston's most notorious neighborhood. The very good title, because stripped down, a lot of strip clubs and things like that. So, and the cover is evocative as well. Welcome. Now, I was going to ask you. I was going to ask you. Well, basically, I had a little introduction. The Combat Zone, the stripped down story of Boston's most notorious neighborhood. For those who don't remember, was a 5-plus-acre site in the city. And it was an adult entertainment district. And you recount the stories of the dancers, the cops, the hookers, the whole milieu, and and also the constitutional and societal issues involved with the Combat Zone. Now, I was going to, like I was saying, when I was at Boston University during the busing crisis era, and as an undergraduate, and I remember I went to the Combat Zone. I wanted to get real life, and all that, and I went to one of those bars, and there was a lady of the night there, and I went up to the bar, and I was about to order, and she says, "Give this kid a glass of milk," and so, and they have my sophistication, whatever I was trying to, So actually, it was a place of education, I think, in a way. I mean, you could say. I
don't know. It's like saying you read Playboy for the articles, not the photos. But yeah, a lot of people went there. A lot of young people, both men and women, but a lot of young men would go there as kind of a, I don't know if you call it a rite of passage, but they knew if they went there, as a friend of mine said, they knew if they went there, they would have a story to last a lifetime.
Yeah, and I always remember those stories. Mm-hmm. Why did you decide to write about the Combat Zone?
Well, I've written a lot about Boston history. So I've written about...
You've written about the drinking history also.
I've written drinking history of Boston. I've written about the Coconut Grove fire. I've written about the infamous Brinks robbery. I've written about the Harbor Islands. And I wrote up with a co-author, Beverly Ford. We wrote the Boston Mob Guide. So we've written a lot about kind of offbeat Boston. And the editor of the publisher were kicking around some ideas, and I have to give her credit. She said, "How about the Combat Zone?" And I said, "Yes, that is the book. That's the story I want to write, because that is a real tale of Boston." And
I mean,
I jumped on it.
It's like Times Square now. Times Square was like that. I remember in the 70s.
Very much so, yeah.
It was bigger, but I mean, but now if you go in there, it's Disneyland. Now, if you go down there, it's sort of
a theater district. Yeah, it's actually become what I think.
And most notably, one of my favorite joints have closed down, Jacob Warris. That was a great restaurant.
Yes, that's a great place. That has a great history. Yeah.
But things go on, right? Mm-hmm. Now. Actually, the Combat Zone was actually, the zone itself was conceived as an antidote to the spread of pornography and things like that.
That's the irony about it, is that it sprung up in the 60s after the Scully Square closed down.
Tell us what Scully Square was.
Scully Square was an area where the government center and City Hall now stands, but it was a warren of little streets, and it was kind of a seedy area, and had a lot of burlesque houses and bars, sailor bars, tattoo parlors.
But did it have the same sort of stuff going on there?
It depends your era. I mean, at the time it was considered very risque, but it was nothing like what would later happen at the Combat Zone. Right. But it was considered this kind of area of Boston where you went to have a good time, and you can take that as many ways as you want. The thing was that it was very popular, and one author once said, more people go to the old Howard, where the burlesque shows were held, than who visit the Bunker Hill Memorial and Faneuil Hall and all those other fancy places.
Would the old Howard sort of be an equivalent to the Pilgrim, which seemed to be a
no, that's kind of hard to say. I don't think it's an equivalent. It certainly had a lot of burlesque shows.
But I meant in terms of its sort of centerpiece, or
The Pilgrim was very important, but also the another major player was the 2 O'Clock Lounge, and the Naked Eye. I mean, those I think were the more prominent clubs in the Combat Zone area. Although there were many, there was the high point. There was at least 34 adult-related entertainment businesses in that area, and that included the clubs, the pornographic theaters, the bookstores, and so there was a variety of adult options right in that area. And the reason it became zoned for that is because it popped up in the 60s for various reasons, a lot of sociological reasons it started. And it was growing, and the city elders and planners, including people like Barney Frank, said, what are we going to do about this? We're trying to build a new Boston, and we have this in the middle of the city. We can't just close it down because of Supreme Court cases. So the decision was made to create a zone for this kind of entertainment, with the hopes that it would stay there and would not travel anywhere else. Because if they had a space,
and they had legislation about this.
They had zoning rules. Yeah, because zoning rules. If you allowed it here, you could ban it elsewhere. You can ban it somewhere.
So there was no isolated porno shops anywhere in the city other than
there were, and there was some effort to get rid of them, but the largest concentration of them was in the Combat Zone. I mean, there were some that sprung up around Copley Square, for example, and Alston Brighton. There was some things, but there was no concentration of
sort of like the Chinatown
like
of porno. I mean, it was Chinatown.
Chinatown was there before that, so you could say, but it was all concentrated in that area there.
Okay. Now, I was interested to hear that, there was a lot of music, and a lot of, actually, you wrote that a lot of musicians, maybe you can talk about that, got their, cut their teeth. And
a lot of people, it was surprising, but I've met a number, I interviewed formally a couple musicians who graduated from the Berkeley School, and they talked about getting gigs at these strip clubs, because when the strip clubs...
Any names that you can mention?
No, they actually asked, I don't use their names. So. But there were Jay Leno got his start as a comedian working at strip clubs at the Teddy Bear, which was kind of in Park Square. It was a little bit outside, but there were many comedians who started in those strip clubs because they were entertainment basis. So we'd have comedians, they'd have musicians, and then they'd have the girls, and the girls were the big draw. When I say originally, I'm talking from the 60s up until, say, the early 80s, maybe just late 70s, but they would have a live band that would perform while the girls did their number. And then they switched over to all tapes and recorded music, so they didn't have that kind of thing going on. But it harked back to what the origins of the Combat Zone, because the origins of Combat Zone was where there were many bars there that had music. It was a very big rock and roll place, and kind of a famous place for people to hang out with. There was a place called Izzy Orts, and Izzy Orts was known for bringing in a lot of jazz musicians, and he had something called the Golden Nugget. It had a reputation as being a dangerous place, but a lot of people went there for the music. Then they had these live musicians playing, and then they got rid of them, and they just had jukebox music, just recorded music.
But an interesting quote was, the average guy who went there was a middle-aged accountant living in Newton and a family man. I mean, is that, you really take that for?
I would say so. I mean, who else would it be? I mean, college students would go there.
So, but I remember, when I remember I went there, there was like some real sleazy types that looked like accountants from Newton. I mean, is that the majority?
Well, there were probably some sleazy types, but the point of that quote was to say, look, the people who go there are not some just all sleazy types. They're just your average person who wants to have a time out. And the reason why that rings true is because it was kind of a dirty little secret, but the Combat Zone was a draw for having conventions in Boston, because the conventioneers could let their wives go shopping and they would go to the Combat Zone. So actually a lot of people came to the Combat Zone when they were out of town. In fact, a gentleman, and I think I quote his name in there, but he talked about when he worked as kind of a bellhop at one of the hotels nearby, and someone would come up to him and say, hey, where's the action? Right. I say, just walk down the street, and there it is.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah. Now, I've also mentioned, and you discovered this after your research about Hand the Hatter, which was this bookstore on LaGrange Street, also. So incongruous with the other stuff.
Yeah, there was. I mean, the thing about this area that it was quite a mixed use there. There was this hat shop we talked about, which turned out to be very famous. There was also something called the Essex Deli, which was, a lot of people remember that, remember the great sandwiches
when
they
was
had
that?
there. That was there from, I would say, the 50s, maybe a little bit earlier, way up until, I think it went out in the 80s. No, I think it was earlier than that. It was maybe in the 70s. And that whole block, that was in the Liberty Tree building, that whole block turned into porno. I talked, one of my interviews was with a man whose father ran a pizza shop in the Combat Zone for many, many years. King of Pizza. Yeah.
But there was a pizza shop there for many years, and which is now like a Chinese marketplace.
Right.
Is that what? Was there the House of Pizza? That was a good pizza place.
That's China's trade center. In fact, I was just there the other day looking at the Boylston building, which is a very historic building. But it was converted into the China Trade Center. They took it by eminent domain, kicked out all the pornography, and the pizza shop, and turned it into this China Trade Center. And they just did work there because they just remodeled the Liberty Tree Plaza or park that was right in front of it, and they just did some more work down there. So things continue to change even as we go on into the 2000s and beyond.
Now, I was going to ask you. There were a lot of strippers there, Chesty Morgan, and there was actually a Jewish woman who was parents owned a delicatessen.
Yes.
Her name June Jordan, was that?
Julie Jordan, yeah. Actually, I talked to a number of women who were Jewish who were strippers.
Yeah, I'm Jewish, so I'm interested about that. You know, I always think of the good Jewish boy, the Jewish girl, but there were a lot of them.
There were a fair number of Jewish women who danced there, and Julie Jordan is a great example of it. She's a marvelous person. In fact, she came to one of my book events, and we did a little dive. Well, she lives out in Arizona, and her husband is a famous a cappella singer, and so she does a lot of work with her husband on that. But she went on to a variety of careers. She's had quite a life. But she is an amazingly sweet, open, warm, wonderful person, and she talked a lot about what it is that got her into the strip clubs and doing this. I mean, she was a hippie, which is a way of saying it, and she went there as kind of a lark, but she did a dance and she got kind of hooked on it. It's kind of odd, but the money was really good. And for a lot of women in those days, there weren't as many opportunities as there are today to make money at a variety of different jobs, not just secretary and waitress and other things.
So it's not a cliche that, I'm working my way through college. Not at all.
That surprised me too, because that is the cliche, but it turns out that's a cliche, that is a real cliche. And I've talked to a number of women who indeed worked their way through college. One woman through law school while dancing in the clubs.
Yeah, I remember reading about many prominent women who actually...
Another woman who became a dean.
Do they keep their background a secret?
One of them does not. I mean, they're not the dean. She says, I don't make a big deal about it.
You can't say.
She's in Arkansas. She's a dean of humanities in Arkansas. I forget which university in Arkansas, but she's written a book under a pseudonym about her experiences. But she's talked about it, and I discussed with her if she wanted me to use her name, and she said yes. People are aware of my background, so I don't try to hide it. I don't make a big thing out of it. But she was the one who had a very interesting observation, because in writing about the strippers and the dancers was really difficult for me, because I wanted to not have a male gaze on this. I didn't want to have the stripper with the heart of gold and the cliches. It was very important to me, because I am a feminist, and I wanted to write about this with not necessarily a feminist perspective, but a clear-eyed perspective on what these women were going through. And many of them look back with pleasure on the situation. Some look back with some trepidation. The ones I talked to all were glad they're out of it, but they don't regret the experience. It was very much a mix, and it was very hard for me to kind of grasp why women would do this, but I could see why they would be attracted to it. this dean, for example, she said, and she did a lot of research on it, she said ultimately, even though women who dance, who strip, who take off their clothes, feel as if they are in control of their lives and it's their own personal expression, ultimately she believes they are sex workers. She believes ultimately they are sex workers.
And I believe when I was reading that, she was talking about a lot of times they have abusive backgrounds, drinking. And
many of them do. Many of them do. And my research in this book was probably kind of skewed because I talked to the women who escaped, who were articulate, who could respond to my queries. There were a lot of women who probably didn't make it. And by that I mean they went into other things, went into deep into prostitution, went deep into drug addiction. So I wasn't able to talk to them. I was able to talk to the women who were had escaped enough that they could talk to me about their life there.
Now, there was one stripper, I think we discussed, Jordan again, or someone like that, who was actually had a short engagement to Cat Stevens.
Yes, that was Princess Cheyenne.
Cheyenne.
Princess Cheyenne's a very interesting case. She declined to speak to me for the book. I have to admit that, but I did a lot of research on her career, and she's again a conundrum of this very powerful, very beautiful, very forceful woman, but who
she didn't look great in that getup in the picture. Yeah.
That's what you say. But I know so many men who went to see her.
Well, that's just a picture. It's probably not a flattering.
So many men. Well, the thing is, you got to understand that we're looking back through eyes that have been trained by the 90s and the 2000s to look at women who are stripped of all their pubic hair, who are skinny to the point of anorexia. She was considered a gorgeous woman, and many men remember her.
Yeah.
Well, no, she just was remembered as a beautiful woman who so many men remember her with this like, Princess Cheyenne. They just thought she was gorgeous. She was apparently a great dancer and had a great way of just expressing herself on stage. And if you look at a lot of the pictures of the early at the 60s and 70s, there's a number of good photographic books about that. I mean, women there looked more authentic than they do now. I mean, for research purposes, I went to the 2 strip clubs that are now operating there, one of which centerfolds
I used to use
chains.
That line for research.
I'm here for research purposes. Yeah, I read. So I went there for research. But anyway, so the women there, there's no. It's not a strip tease because there's no There's no tease. It's all just take off your clothes. They're shaved from top to bottom practically. They do their dance. They sprawl around the floor. Do all that, but I can tell you, even if they're sprawling around the floor, it can't keep a man from looking at his cell phone.
And right, so, that's a big comment.
Yeah. So it's interesting, but that's why I thought this. The reason we're having this conversation, these topics, is the reason I wanted to write this book because it raises so many great issues, so many issues about men, about women, about gender relationships, about power structures. It's a tale of zoning, but it's more than a tale of zoning. And it's not just a tale of a sleazy neighborhood. A lot of people remember that neighborhood with a great fondness. That's what struck me with that. I mean, people work there and live there in the sense they may have had apartments there, but there was this feeling of being outside the norm, being in a sort of different kind of world.
There were artists who lived. I mean, I know Nick Flynn. You've heard of Nick Flynn, who wrote Another Bullshit Night in Suck City.
Exactly.
Lived in that area. Yeah, at just cheap rents and things.
Cheap rents, and so I've run into a lot of people, including some very affluent people. Oh yeah, when I moved to Boston in the '70s, that's where I lived because it was cheap. There's also some real interesting issues about ethnic disparities because of the proximity of Chinatown there. And Chinatown, the people, not all, but some of the leaders in Chinatown at first welcomed the creation of the adult entertainment district because they thought it would help to bring what was going on there under control. It didn't, and then Chinatown leaders were some of the major activists who led the charge to get rid of the combat zone, and they would do patrols at night. They would try to get the city to crack down the prostitution, the crime that was there. I mean, when you think about it, would they put a district like that in Beacon Hill or South Boston? But they put it right next to Chinatown, which had been there for a long time, had predated it.
Yeah. Now, what was I going to say? How, you said there were various explanations for its naming of the combat zone.
Yes, yes.
Maybe you could talk about that.
Well, there are a lot of theories about it. I mean, the one that I think is the most accurate is that it was, and it started in the 50s. So this went way back before, even before Scully Square closed down. But there were a lot of bars there, a lot of music, but a lot of rough bars there, and a lot of sailors and soldiers would go there and get into fights. And the military police were always going in and breaking up fights and hauling people away. So I found a reference by a judge in 1950 who declared this is really a combat zone, and he was referring to all the fights that were breaking out in that area. So I think that's the most logical explanation. But for like one of these nicknames, it just emerged. We won't know for certain. But really by the time of 1964, it was codified. It was part of the language, particularly when the Herald, I think it was the Record American that time. It was a Herald American, Record. One of the newspapers there did an expose, a whole series of what was happening in the so-called combat zone. Mm-hmm. And that was the name that really brought it to the forefront. And a lot of those articles, by the way, were written by Gene Cole, whose brother went on to was Kevin Cole, who was an photo editor at the Boston Herald, and she was kind of one of those pioneering women journalists who worked for some of the papers here.
Actually, the end. You say the end of the combat zone was sort of marked, or was started by the killing of a Harvard student.
Well. That's an interesting point. A lot of people will tell you that the end of the combat zone came about in 1976 when a Harvard student, a resident, a native of the North End, he was a native Bostonian, and a football player, was with a bunch of guys who went to the combat zone, and things got out of hand. There was a fight, and he was stabbed to death. And that certainly cast a pall about it. But that was in 1976, and the combat zone went on for at least another decade. So I think it was something that in the minds, that shifted the minds of a lot of people from this is a place for adults to hang out to this is a very dangerous place and really, really need to do something about it.
So they changed the liquor laws, didn't they? They say you can either have girls or you can have liquor.
Well,
and then they,
that was used. Well, no, they didn't change the laws, but they would try to yank the licenses because there's two kinds of licenses. There was liquor licenses and an entertainment license. So they would yank one or the other. And so a place could stay open, but they couldn't serve liquor, or they could serve liquor, but they couldn't have girls dancing. So these were just tools that the city used. There was a whole cat and mouse war between the regulators, the police, what was going on there. A lot of people said the police looked the other way. A lot of people said that politicians looked the other way. There were mob interests there in the zone that affected it as well.
I just want to ask you, we got a few minutes left, 4 minutes, but touch a bit about the Wilbur Mills case.
Oh, the Wilbur Mills. I love this case, given what's happened now. But Wilbur Mills was a congressman, a very powerful congressman from Arkansas, a really good old boy, but very, very powerful. Well, he got pulled over back in 1974. His car got pulled over, and a young woman jumped out of his car into the tidal basin. And turned out she was a stripper who worked under the name the Argentine Firecracker and the name Fanny Fox. And she was, and Wilbur Mills said, well, she was in the car because I was helping out. I'm helping her with her career. I'm looking out for her. She's a constituent. I would do that for any constituent. And so he got away with it because he got reelected, even though he was hanging out with a stripper. But then one evening, Fanny Fox was performing at the Pilgrim Theater in Boston. And after this incident, she was now billed as the tidal basin bombshell and was making a huge load of money because having notoriety makes you a great stripper. So lo and behold, during the middle of her act, she said, "Oh, I want you to meet someone. Come out." And Wilbur Mills came out and hung with her on the stage in the Pilgrim Theater in Boston. And people took pictures, and this was just too much, even for his constituents. He resigned, or he didn't resign, he didn't run for office, he went into AA, he admitted he had problems, and that was the end of his career. Now, today, he would be elected president.
Yeah, that's how I was.
So she was kind of the Stormy Daniels. So Fannie
Did they actually have an affair or long?
I'm sure they did. Yeah, she wrote a book about it.
Yeah, and how did his wife deal with it?
Wife stuck with him.
Yeah, long suffering.
Yeah, stuck with him to the bitter end. Yeah, Fannie Fox did a story about the stripper and the congressman. So she tried to play her notoriety out as much as she could. She later went back to Argentina. I could not find her. So.
Yeah. It's interesting how different it was played back then.
Yes, back then, yes.
Yeah. You have any readings coming up?
Well, I don't have readings coming. I can't remember off the top of my head. I do have some things coming up, but what I would ask is people to check my website, which is www.stephanieschorow.com, and I will be talking about a number of my books in different places around the area. So the best thing to do is to check that website. You can also buy The Combat Zone on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, but I always ask people to go to their local bookstore and try to support their
favorite,
book.
like Quarter Square Books?
Quarter Square Books or Trident Bookstore, places like that where you can go and have a cup of coffee while you buy and support these.
Are you still writing for any newspapers? Or?
I'm still freelancing for the Boston Globe occasionally. I write some food stories for their suburban section. I'm teaching now, and I'm working on a novel. That's my next step is to actually try my hand at some fiction. So I've got a novel in the works.
What would a novel give us?
It's going to be totally something different, but it's kind of the elevator pitch is that well, you've heard of chick lit, right?
Yeah.
Chick lit. Well, this is what I call kit lit, because this is about 4 women, their relationships with each other, relationship with their men, and their cats.
And a cat.
And
I love cats.
So
actually, there's a writer here for the Boston Globe who writes about cats. I interviewed her, and I forget she's.
It's written about.
Yeah. I can't remember her name.
Yeah.
But she's,
well, cats are great. Put this way.
Yeah,
but it's kind of an exploration of women and men and cats. It's set in the 80s. It's very different from anything I write in terms of nonfiction, but it's just something that I felt like I wanted to do. So I'm trying my hand. And the thing is, and as I teach my students, many of the techniques that you use in writing nonfiction are drawn from fiction. Your goal in even in nonfiction, create characters, create a narrative, a storyline, create a sense of place, use a character as a place, and these are things that the really good nonfiction writers, not me, but the really good ones do.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.